have slightly, sorry. Okay, guys, sorry about that. I'm back. So, what we've outlined now is the human aspect, the behavioral aspect, and then said that it's about behavior and usually about weighing up benefits. So, the caveat for economic motions is oftentimes this: is that while economic motions are primarily and usually very obviously has a utility-based argument, economics motions might not always be about economics alone, right? It could be about a combination of other different things that factor into the motion. And we oftentimes ignore. So a good example of this would be, for let's just go back to bank bailouts, because I think everybody here probably has bumped into one or two bank bailout debates or something similar before. This house will bail out banks, yeah? And the idea is banks are too big to fail. If we let them fail, they cripple systems and societies, because a lot of people have deposited money there and they need to get their money back. And when they don't, it just seems like the money just gets pushed. And that is obviously something people don't want to see. On the flip side, you have the problem of banks being a very problematic actor in society, oftentimes being the root cause or motivators of some of the worst harms that have been experienced in society, either by trying to bribe politicians through lobbying tactics and, for example, trying to fuel chaotic systems, or sometimes just being all around bad people, right? So, and most times they lose their money out of responsibility. So that itself becomes a very unique and complex problem to be engaged. Why is this particular system very interesting? I think it's interesting because in a motion like this, what you happens here is that there is the obvious economic debate. So bail them out, and they are probably going to repeat this again on upside. On government side, it's bail them out. They're too big to fail. You can't throw everybody into poverty. It doesn't make any sense. But there are also more subtle moral debates. So, for example, the idea of like fair and equal punishment for the actions committed. That at the point in time where banks have been irresponsible, at the point in time where banks have caused this amount of chaos and have in many instances knowingly caused harm to local people, that the fairest process or the retributive process, if there was to be any justice related to banks, is to let them collapse and let the people in charge of those banks sleep in cells. And oftentimes that is not what happens. So now, in a debate like this, where these two classes exist, being able to identify the non-debating and also make it relevant and then utilize it to outweigh the opposite team could oftentimes be very useful. So you could then come in and say, you know what, the problem we have is we think that these companies do deserve to be punished. And here is why. It's because they are genuine people that suffer from these systems and these policies. Not necessarily because, not necessarily only because of the collapse, but because of consistent bad decisions and exploitative policies that they've put in over the years. Explain how, for example, banks have been used to oppress people of minority groups by refusing to give them access to significant capital, blah, 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 and build up on all those things. You can make banks the big bad and say, you know what, we get this chance to punish them, or we're not going to. The worst way to do this is rather than seeing a big bad that does bad things and then encouraging them by giving them bailouts. What you do is hold them accountable and let retribution take charge on them. And that's a pretty decent way of arguing and will allow you maximize really good outcomes for yourself. So that's something you guys can consider if you're trying to win rounds. Yeah. The next thing that works, and I think is grossly underrated in its ability to work, is to prevent yourself from being caught in this weird trap where you have the argument, and you've run this very brilliant economics argument, and then some crackhead from closing runs what I just said. What you need to do is explicit and very clear impacting. This is explaining why your argument is relevant and how it works. Yeah. And at the core of this is you don't just stop at saying, you know what, we've made this argument and we showed you how it's beneficial, how it saves more money, how it makes some people richer. You go a little deeper, and what you then do is explain why those outcomes are important. So, for example, if you have an argument around government giving welfare checks to poorer people, yes, is not just as simple as, okay, they can stimulate the economy, they get a lot more freedom, and they can now develop themselves. You can then go deeper and then say, you know what, a big part of why this is so useful is that government has a specific obligation with the weakest part of the community to help them and benefit them. While this is usually seems like added context, just a little bit of framing around the debate, it oftentimes makes your arguments a lot more relevant, especially when someone tries to out moral you or make the debate about something that's not economics, and then you have a wider reaching case that has a very specific and clear weight. So even if you pull it outside of the economic debate, you can still see why it's relevant beyond just providing people money. So a good way of doing this is impacting, explaining why the outcomes you're proving are important, and then like significant amount of framings around the debate. I think if you're able to do those things very well, then you oftentimes find yourself at the front end of a debate. Now, onto more debate or core debate related terms and explain how to engage those terms as a whole. I think that would be really helpful. So, first off, and I think this is general advice, guys, economics is sort of like IR in the sense that what you don't know, you can't argue or you won't argue well. So, as much as economics is stuff that you can sometimes intuit by yourselves, you need to do a significant portion of reading that is a priori relevant to understanding economics. My advice is the same way they are ongoing and very popular economic issues that make international relation issues that make headlines. They are ongoing popular economic issues that make headlines. For example, issues on the stock market, the issues I think early December, that South Africa had banks, all of these things. If you track them, maybe follow the economist, you probably get access to them. And when you see mechanisms that don't particularly make sense to you, maybe take out time to watch like a 5 or 7 minutes YouTube video to explain it. The thing is this year is that unlike IR, where it's situation specific, the moment you understand the mechanisms to create an outcome, you can continuously apply it across multiple instances. And then that's what makes it slightly different from IR. But beyond that, it functions largely the same. It's about having information, being able to utilize that information in the best way possible, and then utilizing that to create like very significant outcomes. Yeah. So just let me handle my news again. Sorry. Okay, at this point, I just want to ask if there are any questions across board so I can engage them. Are there any questions, guys? I'll just give that 2 minutes. If there are no questions, then we move to the next page. Because there's nothing in the chat, I'll move to micro and macroeconomics, the difference between micro and macroeconomics. Yeah. So microeconomics is probably, in very simple terms, the way in which like small institutions or small people, smaller people spend money. So this could look like a small business it could look like apart from a small business, it could look like you as a person, it could look like a household. So it's essentially how smaller groups spend money. And then at this point is primarily about how like larger group bodies, usually governments, spend money and their outcomes or the influences or the way this influences like people, right? Why is this context particularly useful? Yeah, it's useful because for the most part, it ends up making things very simple, right? The first thing you need to realize about micro and macro economics is that they realistically and most times do not offer or create moderately similar impacts. So the exact same policy when experienced in micro terms and macro terms have very significantly different impacts. So let me give you an example, right? It's prudence, yeah? So if you're in a household or a small business, saving money is that a financially strong or solid. Yes. So the less you spend, the better it is for you and society, right? So if you save more money, you have more money, and that is all beneficial. Now, for governments, prudence isn't always considered a good thing, right? Which is why you get sometimes it's right? Two reasons why. One, every time government uses one under some capital intensive project or spending money for the sake of saving resources, what it does is twofold. One, it fails to fulfill its obligation to citizens, people that it's meant to protect and make their lives. So if government like we expand those roads or save the money and they save this money. The first thing is that it fucks over the citizens. The second thing, I think is often very useful in the context, is that it actually ends up having its own benefits and financial interests. Why? Because the faster an economy grows, the more money that is put in, the more reserves you get out of it. So, how do I explain this? If you spend money sending kids to school, they go on to school and they become much more skilled. And because of that, they're able to earn. And because they're able to earn, they then, by extension, improve the quality of your economic system because they've now added more to the society because of access. So while the difference I think here is simple, is while expenditure micro skill, so for smaller families and smaller groups, it's just people spending money. For larger families and larger groups, expenditure quite literally investment. So if I go and I dump 20 million somewhere as a loan, it's an investment, it's not just expenditure. So oftentimes that's the context. Why is this context so important? Because half the time we're teams are to it or trying to make economic arguments, we oftentimes, in the most messy ways possible, forget that in arguing cause and effect, we are meant to consider other factors. And the thing is, most economic debates are macroeconomic debates. So you really ever stop how should that happen? Yeah. But a lot of debates are about how should government spend money, where should they invest, how should they invest. So you need to hold this in context. Now, there are obviously still some similarity principle, but this is an explicit sense of money because a big part of economics will pay to maintain and you with and food. So if you have this as a stock public better arguments. Moving on beyond that, the next thing I'm going to explain is foreign reserves because oftentimes economics debates intersect and about how governments spend money. What is the foreign reserve? How does it work? What does this mean in the simplest of consequence? And how does this influence history? So I'm going to explain this by explaining simple. Yeah? If a state was to save money, they can't just save their currency. Why? And this is going to be like a short breakthrough into currency. They are going to come back. Currency is a derived version of money, right? So that means that it's only relevant because of what it can get you and not because of what it actually is. And that means that money is only relevant because you can buy things with it. So, like if I carry a billion naira to America and I've never changed it becomes automatically useless. So, the relevance of the currency is what it can get you. The reason why this becomes very important is simple. Is that because states are the people that create currency, they are the people that print and you cannot collect. So when states are doing deals and buying and selling each other, and you say, okay, I'm going to pay by giving you a whole lot of naira, most companies will not accept that naira, probably because it's part of retail. So it's just paper to them. But more important, even if they accept it has a significant impact on your economy because the more of your currency is available, the less value it is. Now, this is first computer basic principle of scarcity and abundance, right? The scarcer something is more valuable it is. The less scarcity, the less value. That is a priori very obvious, right? But beyond that, you then have to realize that what happens there in the simplest way is that because more then there is more wealth or more cash in contrast to the amount that your country has, which means that there is more money to spend to acquire say or similar. Now, this is also what causes inflation, but in this instance, it causes inflation because I expect. I'll come back afterwards. The currency dynamics of this is pretty simple. Is at the point where you have this amount of chaos because you created out of currency or you use your currency to pay off things. You financially cripple your own economy. You take it too much risk, and oftentimes other countries simply don't accept it. So it means it's a priori possible to save money in your currency. But states need to and more importantly, because your savings oftentimes represents the strength of the currency. How? One, the amount of reserves you have is a good sign of stability of your economy. Because if you have a large amount of reserves, it means that the economy has an issue. You can easily tap into reserves and solve the problem. What that means is that by extension, more trust in your economy. And because you have more trust in your economy, they by extension are more willing to do business in your economy, which means they bring their resources to your economy, which by extension strengthens your economy. I hope that logical for me says. So what then becomes very interesting is countries still want to create reserves. So how do they create these reserves? They create these reserves by doing much of smart thing. But sometimes reserves exist for resources. What kind of resources? Oftentimes you do the same form of resources that a greater percentage of needs and not just. So a good example of a resource people oftentimes have is something like oil. So there are literally a lot of have oil reserves, but that's and the good reason why most oil producing countries are sustainable or fairly stable in their economic structure because they have a good amount of oil reserves. Shout out to Saudi Arabia. But on the flip side, the next thing that I feel is they also keep things like gold, because gold is usually considered a significantly high number and it's a fairly interesting. So, but when you can't keep this thing, or when keeping this becomes complicated, the last thing you keep is another country's currency. Right? Usually, a country that's specific cost right? So the most common version of this is the dollar, right? And oftentimes that means that a lot of countries keep and store dollars in their accounts, right? The countries that store significant amount of dollars in priority just represent having stronger accounts. Some countries store euros. Recently, some countries have been storing Chinese yuan and a bunch of other sources of wealth. The outcome of all of this is when you store these things, you end up having like a pool of economic wealth that you store. Obviously, the most popular one is dollars, but with the rise of other strong economic countries like that, it's fine. So that is in the simplest of the risk involved is if your country or the country you're backing or the country whose currency you have does nonsense, you get you become collateral damage because your economy goes down. So oftentimes you take materials so that you can help each other out. Then another factor that needs to be important is you need a good amount of that currency and you a priori to some very dependent on their currency because you are a victim of economic policies at this point. So if the US decides to start printing dollars to like maybe counter some deflation or to give out and your currency, the value of those reserves go down, and by extension, you get spent. I hope just give me like a minute. Maybe Okay, so just to confirm if you guys can still hear me, right? So back to what I was saying. How does this then all influence the balance of trade? It influences the balance of trade in a very simple way. And first off, what's the balance of trade? Balance of trade is countries trade amongst themselves, and in the process of this trade, currencies are sent in multiple directions. So it goes from wealthy groups to poorer groups, from poorer groups to wealthy groups, right? And that means, for example, if I am buying like a log, like 50 logs of timber from Ghana, I can't just carry my naira there and give them and say, give me 50 logs of timber. The, the timber makes no sense. The naira makes no sense to them. So they're not going to hand over the timber. So what I have to do is convert that naira to cedi. By doing that, I have transported a significant portion of the value of my currency to their currency. And by doing that, they have gained a significantly greater resource through that trade. Of course, by extension, I get the timber and I call back and use it to create value for my people, yes? But that by extension strengthens their currency. How does it strengthen their currency? These two things, right? Is that the values of currency are oftentimes represented to like supply and demand. So the more of a currency is available, that means the greater the supply, then the lower the value. The more of a currency is demanded, the greater the demand, the greater the value. So two these currencies try to do, right, to maintain their value. Limit supply, but at the same time, try to maximize demand, right? And this is where it becomes complicated. I will get to devalue currency soon because of this, right? So at the core of it all is simple. Is that balance of trade means the more people are buying from you, the stronger your currency would get because your currency is highly being demanded for. The less people are buying from you and the more you buy from people, the weaker your currency gets over time because whereas you are providing some sort of value, you are at the same vein not creating enough for the amount of money you are spending. So your currency slowly weakens because in contrast to the supply of your currency, the amount of demand there are for external currencies, which is the amount of times your currency is used to buy external currencies, is a lot higher. And that in turn makes your currency becomes weaker, right? Now, the thing that then makes sense at this point is simple, is that oftentimes people want strong currencies, but people don't want currencies that are too strong. And this is where it gets complicated. So balance of trade exists to obviously allow your currency get stronger. So is that you want to sell more than you are buying, but in the same vein, you don't want to create a currency that's too strong. And let me explain this in a way that makes sense. So if I can buy one chair for $1, right? I will probably come here and buy that chair. The more expensive that chair is, the less willing I am to buy it. Probably one in contrast to other competitors, maybe like Russia, China, or something else. But in the same vein, it just means I have less money. I just have the same amount of money, but I can acquire a lot less resources. Which means that when I go back and sell it, I'm making a whole lot less profit. And because of that, I have less money to bring back to buy for the second time. What this means is not as sustainable. So sometimes some currencies intentionally devalue their currency. So we see this in Nigeria, we see this in Ghana, we see this largely in third world countries where you do this for the purpose of attracting more trade. Now, just to be clear, devaluing is not always a good policy, and I'm going to get to why. But the goal of devaluation is you weaken your currency so that people can buy more for what was oftentimes the same value of goods, and then they're able to get more wealth, come back and reinvest it. But in the same vein, because people can buy more for the same price. More people are just naturally attracted to your industry. So, for example, imagine you had like a soda and a lot of people liked that was maybe 10 naira or 50 cedis. Yeah. And all of a sudden, that drink became 25 cedis. People will be more willing to buy that drink by extension. And that by extension pulls in a whole lot more traffic into that system, right? And that is essentially what benefits those structures and how that works. The next thing that needs to be understood, moving out from that point, is how to how this all plays out. One, the problem that exists with devaluation is simple. Is that it doesn't necessarily mean that people will come and buy from you. Again, this is the human behavior part, yeah? So if you are known for selling substandard products, even if you devalue your currency, people might not come because they still think your stuff is nonsense. And nobody wants to buy nonsense, even that no matter how cheap it is. So that itself happens. The second thing is sometimes you don't produce anything. So if you're not really producing anything and your currency becomes weaker, nobody is still going to come and buy because they can't buy anything that's non-existent. So that itself becomes a problem. The third issue is, for example, you are selling primary products, so crude oil, timber, all of these things, bitumen, cobalt. These aren't particularly things that, one, demand for shifts to a very significant extent, right? That's the first issue. Second of all, a lot of these things have fixed tag prices. So as long as you produce the same amount in dollars, that will come either way. So you don't really shift the market. So for example, if you're selling crude oil, you produce 180 million barrels a day. The 180 million barrels you produce is probably policed by some organization, so you can't produce more. But in the same vein, you will still have to sell the 180 million barrels irregardless. And there it becomes the problem because even if you devalue your currency, you're still going to sell $180 million barrels and still get the dollar value of that, regardless of what you do. So you're either making room to get yourself scammed if you choose to sell in your local currency at that point, or nothing changes. The significant outcome of this is explains why devaluation, although at initial seems like a good idea, sometimes, depending on the state of your economy, can be a bad one. I hope that makes sense. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, since we're done with that, I'm just going to do a quick walkover on inflation and then why inflation can sometimes be good, why deflation is sometimes bad, and all of that. So there is a certain amount of goods that is available in every country, right? And this is like money, wealth, all of that, right? And these goods are sold and bought and have like certain financial transactions that go on with them. What inflation means is that the amount of money available to these goods, in contrast to the goods available in your society, has increased, right? So, for example, imagine if we had like 50,000 naira and there was maybe 20 chairs, and now we have 55,000 naira and there are still 20 chairs. What happens at that point is there has been 5% inflation, right? And actually, not 5%, 10% inflation. And at that point, the economy has sort of grown larger, has sort of expanded with regards to its financial ability, right? Now, the problem with inflation is there is more money being created, and sometimes the goods don't change, or the goods don't change as much. And because of that, there is a fear that the value of money keeps on getting worse and worse. And that itself becomes a problem. Because what a lot of this money goes to business people. because if you're a fixed wage salary earner, your earnings don't change. So if you're earning 100,000 before inflation, the fact that inflation occurs does not mean you start earning 110,000. Most companies do not adjust. Of course, nowadays big companies do take an active attempt to adjust for inflation, but even then, that adjustment for inflation, even in those big companies, is rarely ever done at a rate that is commensurate. And what then happens is that the decision makers in those places, which are like businesses, the investors, and the people that accrue most of this wealth, the outcome of this and why it's really so frustrating is because when it's all said and done, people that then get so much wealthier, so much richer because of this process are oftentimes the same people that run these businesses. So the outcome is these businesses get significantly rich. The average person gets significantly poorer, and the economy kind of becomes like a mess. Yeah, that's the context that needs to be understood in this particular debate, right? Moving on from there is what deflation is. Deflation, on the flip side, is where the amount of goods in a market or industry stay the same or reduce, but they reduce at a rate that is smaller than the reduction of the rate of money in the society. So that by extension means now the system improves. What this looks like is you have $50,000 and you have 20 shares. Now you have $45,000 and then there are still 20 shares. What happened was that there was a deflation of 10%. Now, why is this problematic? Is that in this instance, salary has benefits, but it's problematic because it oftentimes is a telling sign of a shrinking economy. And oftentimes, what does this mean? One is two things happen when deflation happens. One, people are just significantly less willing to give out because if the value of money is greater, in contrast, people are more willing to give out loans, but it has a very weird influence. But people are less willing to take loans. So if the value of money is greater in contrast to actually building commodities or structures, then when you take out a loan, you then, by extension, find yourself in a very complicated situation where, because the value of money is consistently going up, and then you have to run a business or you have to do something that involves creating goods, while the value of goods is consistently going down, then you find yourself in a particularly weird position where you are significantly likely to lose out, especially considering that you need to pay interest. On the flip side, where deflation exists, people are less willing, loaners or loan sharks or banks are less willing to give loans because the value of money is consistently decreasing, but in the same vote, the value of goods is going up. What happens at that point is that because we're giving out a lot of goods and the value of goods is going up, you're very likely to pay the loan, but they need that value to go up in such a way that the money that you're paying them in is commensurate to the value, at least in which the currency has gone up and which the currency has devalued. So, for example, if the value of a currency goes down 20% because of inflation, and I gave you a loan, if you give me the exact same amount, I've made a 20% loss because that money is worth 20% loss less. So you have to give me, this is why interest exists. This is a good example of why interest exists beyond just profit. So you have to give me this money at a certain percentage to one, commensurate me to make it equal, then a certain higher percentage to then make the system fairer in the sense of me for giving you that money for about a certain period of time. And that is how loans work. That is how inflation works. And that's how interest systems are influenced by inflation because people are trying to not make losses. As a collective whole works, just to put it in context. So there is that. The next thing that needs to be considered is oftentimes this is how banks figure out how much they loan people. Now, deflation rarely ever happens. It almost realistically never happens. But inflation happens everywhere in the world. Now, what is good inflation and what is bad inflation? But first and foremost, we must understand why deflation is always bad. The reason why deflation is always bad is that deflation doesn't just mean the value of money goes up. It also means that people are less willing to produce goods based on the mechanism I explained before. Because the value of goods is going down in contrast to money. Then the smartest thing to do is to not take a loan to start producing goods with less value. Or second of all, just hold on to your money and watch all the value of goods go down. The problem with that is people are less willing to participate in economic processes. And at the point in time where people are not participating in economic processes, the economy is dying. So at first, it's 20 chairs and then $45,000. But at some point, maybe by the time it goes to $40,000, it's now maybe 80 chairs and $40,000. Primarily because of inflation, nobody's willing to still keep producing chairs. So people just hold on to their wealth, and now the number of chairs in that system have reduced. The reason why this is problematic is because while this reduction happens, there are people on ground that actually needed those chairs, and now they can't get them. And this is very problematic when you now talk about necessities like food, water, like social amenities and stuff like that. That people oftentimes, not social amenities, but general amenities that people buy and are no longer available because of this kind of systems. So that just puts it into context as to why deflation is almost always bad. Now, inflation on the flip side can be good because inflation or the setting controlled rate refers to the fact that your economy is growing. Because if people think that the value of money is reducing, if you just simply dump it somewhere, you're willing to give out. You're also willing to take loans to produce goods. And at that point in time, at that point in time, people use that money, they invest it, and use it to create economic systems, economic value, and all of that. So while inflation might at first look like 55 chairs to 20 seats, by the time it gets to maybe 55,000 to 20 seats, by the time you get to 60,000, it might be 22 seats to 60,000 because the 10,000 that was spent in producing value. So it's a sign of growth. Now, it only becomes problematic when the inflation goes at a very high rate, like you see in third world countries, like 20%, 37%. But when it's around about 7 to 10%, it's a sign that the economy is steadily growing. And as an extension, like we should all just like be in a good place and be thankful for what's going on in the economy. So those are the possible ways in which that plays out. So there is good inflation, there is bad inflation, depending on what rate it's going at. And then deflation is pretty much always bad because it means that people stop producing and that just cripples the system. So that itself is the most basic, simple or actually is that everybody is chasing their own benefits. You have to concede to the risk that their benefits won't always align with the benefits of everybody in society. What that by extension means is if your benefits are not aligned, conflict is very likely to exist. Why would that conflict exist? The most simple and honest to God, the most obvious reason has always been because people would want to exploit the system to make money. And this is exactly the problem when banks come in. And then banks start trying to do things like creating bubbles, artificial bubbles, and then bailing out of the bubbles fast enough to make wealth, giving weird loads, and then trying to defraud the system with forex exchanges and all of that. Now, the thing is, all of these are motivated by people's personal interest. So when debating economics, especially around how people act. When you see a loophole that can be exploited, identify that human personal interest can sometimes lead to that exploitation. And even if most people are good, the outcomes of people at the very top doing this can oftentimes be risky. The next thing you need to realize is that because of these particular desires to exploit systems, especially economics debates, that you can end up in the most counterintuitive situations possible. So sometimes think about it like this. What's the one way someone in power can make this go very wrong? And then explain why that process would happen. It's a very good rebuttal to most economic outcomes. Of course, corruption is the go-to, but corruption is not as impactful anymore because oftentimes corruption is either non-comparative or more realistically something that you cannot explicitly mechanize to the point where you can say, you know what, is going to be a problem. What you can mechanize is internal greed and company policies. What does that mean? Companies have a policy of making wealth, right? Or creating wealth for their stakeholders and shareholders. So if they are trying to make a lot of money, it just stands to reason that they are going to probably try and exploit people. This looks like exploiting workers. This looks like exploiting future employees. This looks like exploiting systems. This looks like sometimes getting subpar goods and all of that. All of these are mechanisms that could exist. So why is this particularly crucial? It's because this is where regulatory bodies come in. Regulatory bodies understand that there are capitalist interests for people, and they need to limit this from creating anti-competitive laws to ensuring quality control. For something like SEC, they also involve themselves ensuring like that trades are done properly and companies are caught themselves in the way that they should. Now, why is all of this relevant? Because you need to understand the dynamics between these groups. FCC's goal is to maximize economic production, but do it in a healthy way, like every other regulatory body. They want you to produce, they want to maintain that production, they want trades to happen, but they want it to be done in a healthy way. Now, companies, on the other hand, want trades to happen, but they want it to happen in a way that benefits them. Sometimes this can be healthy, sometimes this can be unhealthy. So if you understand these incentives, you identify how they play out, how they work, what motivates them, the outcomes that they create, and who is most influenced by these outcomes. And if you're able to do that, then you're oftentimes able to create and engage the debate in a way that maximizes really good outcomes. Yeah. And that itself is oftentimes super valuable in the debate because at the point in time where you need to get a win, the smartest way to get that win is just to explain the incentives actors have and explain how those actors act out those incentives. So going forward, as I said before, behavioral stuff, understand the behavioral stuff, do the reading and understand what those things mean and use them to establish your mechanisms. Any other questions, guys? So this is where we ask for questions if there are any. So just take like 5 minutes, see if there are any questions.